All right. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Wrigley, and you are now on the Mo You Know show. Thank you for tuning in. I have a very special guest today. I have Dr. Dante Bryant, Assistant Professor of Social Work, Affiliate Faculty, and of Department of Africana Studies at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Bryant.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Some of you all that are watching today may remember Dr. Bryant from the Moments of Truth podcast that we did a few weeks ago in the midst of the social unrest. And you got raving, I wouldn't call it reviews, but so many people wanted to talk with you. How do I get in touch with him because of the wealth of information? So we just appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to help us unpack a topic that is so heavy and so relevant right now. And that topic is, why is racism discussed as a black and white topic in America, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah, so we're going to have some conversation here. We're going to learn, transfer some knowledge. So this is everyone that's viewing an interactive show. So if you have a comment or a question for Dr. Bryant or myself, which I might defer to you, Dr. Bryant, please feel free to put it in the comment section. I'll be monitoring that as we go along as well. But, you know,
I'm laughing because Stephen Bostic, guy I went to high school with, just logged in. But anyway, I'm sorry. Please continue.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Yeah, or high school. Oh, okay. So people know you from all over. Awesome. Well, I don't know as I started thinking about the topic, I have friends all over the place, all over the world, realistically, to really be honest with you. And it seems to be a point of discussion that we need to talk about around, racism and why is it always black and white. And as I was doing some reading and research, there was something that resonated with me. So like, when you're watching a lot of these documentaries and reading the books and you hear about stories of slavery or even current day type of racism, I've believed, as I was doing some research around the topic, that it's really important to be intentional in remembering that these occurrences are real and not some just like bestseller fictional book or like a screenplay. These are like real life events that have happened to people or that are currently happening to real people. And I think it's important, and people have to be intentional of any race to remember that. And I think that plays a huge part personally in why we talk black and white, and there's angst around the black and white, because I think that racism sometimes is thought of that black people are exaggerating it or it's an old problem and etc. But what are your thoughts around some of the downstream impacts or aspects of not keeping in mind that racism on blacks in America is real? And I know you're laughing, but I think it's a real, because I really had to, as I heard of some of the horrible stories, had to literally close my eyes and think about it that way. Like I had to visualize that.
I will say this, right? I think we forget this, right? You think about black people in this country have been here for roughly 400 years. Mm-hmm. 400, right? Mm-hmm. We were slaves from 1619 to 1865. That's about 246 years. Black codes in Jim Crow from 1865 to 1965. So that's 100 years. So now you're talking about 250 years, right? 350 years of the 400 years that we've been here, we were either slaves or we were considered non-citizens, non-full citizens. People forget that Black Americans just became full citizens 55 years ago. Like, we forget that. And so when we're having these conversations around like the history of racism, we tend to think slavery and it was over after slavery. But we forget about, for instance, like Reconstruction of the Reconstruction. We forget about slave codes. We forget about black codes. We forget about Jim Crow, and we forget that literally 55 years ago, African Americans were just made full U.S. legally considered to be full citizens in this country.
Okay.
So I think that's, and it's, which is astounding when you think about it, right? You think we became full citizens 55 years ago, and we had a black president literally, right, the last term.
Right.
And what was astounding was that while Obama was in presidency, all of a sudden now we had conversations around this idea that we were in a post-racial society. And we have racism is over. We have a black president. It's not a problem anymore. I'm getting feedback. Is that my mic or is?
I think it is, because it's sounding a little muffled every now and then.
Okay, let me see if I can change something real quick. Is that better?
Yes, to me.
Are you getting any feedback? No feedback?
Not right this minute.
Okay. So we started having conversations about being in a post-racial society while Barack Obama was president. And the idea of that is, it's absurd when you think about it, right? When you consider, like, think about it like this: 40% of Americans, or adult Americans, are obese, roughly 40%, right? And what they found is that the overwhelming majority of those people who are obese is because of their diet. So they have bad eating habits. Eating habits are established by the time you're 10 years old. That's what most research says, right? Mm-hmm. So by the time these people were 10 years old, they had established bad eating habits. They're 40 and they still have good eating habits, and as a result, they're obese. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, 10 years of education, you have not undone over a 30-year period. You have not, something as simple as your eating habits, you haven't corrected over the course of 30 years. And so you're mean to tell me that in 350 years, you have a system of white supremacy, anti-blackness, and racism that all of a sudden you've corrected in the last 50 years. Like, the idea of that is absurd, right? It's difficult for a single person to change their behavior, even if it's been established in a short period of time, of create a habit over the course of a year, over 2 years. But the idea that an entire country can change its nature, that it actively established, reaffirmed, concretized, right, built upon for 350 years, and all of a sudden in the last 55 years, they're going to pivot and go the completely opposite direction. But yet and still, when Obama was president, we were having these conversations that we're in a post-racial society. Now it's, okay, now we have a new president, our new person in the presidential office, and we're like, oh, wow, racism actually still is a problem in this country. So I think it's important for people to realize, to kind of put all of this in perspective when they're reading those stories, when they're listening to those discourses. Because one thing is for certain is that any group that has been oppressed, whether it's women, whether we're talking about people who are Black, they have always been more accurate at describing the social reality than the people who oppress them.
Sorry about that. I've been muting myself. So when we think about it, to go back to what you said, it's almost like when Obama became president, it was in some people's head, it was like a magic, it's fixed button that kind of went off. Like, everything is good. We have a Black president. There is no more racism. Problem solved. And so now you were talking about something that is old news. Let's move on and figure out how we can make America be great again, right? Or be great moving forward. So I completely get what you're saying, and that it's almost like you said, kind of like a habit. And there's things that have to happen to change, and it takes more time than than what we've had to necessarily.
No, I would say even more than a habit, right? It's part of our country's nature, right? And so what I mean by that, I think you have to mute your mic. I think mine's getting feedback for whatever reason. But I think it's more than just a habit. It's actually part of our constitutive nature. Right? When you think about the fact that the idea of race does not exist in the United States until about 1677, right? We have Bacon's Rebellion, right? And all of a sudden the planter elite, who we would consider today to be like the top 1%. The top 1% realized that Bacon, what he did, but he basically galvanized slaves and indentured servants to rebel against some colonial settlers who were supplied and funded by the British elite. And the British elite realized very quickly that they needed to break that up. And the best way to do that was by race, right? Prior to this, people were understood as they were broken up by ethnicity, culture, right? Nation, state, whatever you want to call it. But race generally wasn't a category. And so they literally constructed the definitions of whiteness and blackness. And this is the first time you see black and white, literally these terms referring to people in American law. And what they said was, in an effort to divide, because they didn't want any more militias like this coalition, a coalescing of slaves and indentured servants coming together to rebel. Because not only did Bacon's Rebellion happen, but also happened in other groups. Other smaller coalitions started coming together to do the same thing. And so like, we need to divide these working class people up because there's more of them than there are of us. And if they really decide to take us over, they can. So they decided the way they were going to do that was to break them up by race. And so for the first time in the history of this country, and right around 1677, you see the terms black referring to a human being, right? And the terms white referring to the human being show up in the law for the first time. And literally under white, it said, a person of European descent who has white skin and is inherently free, right? So the definition of whiteness and freedom were coextensive. And what's also fascinating about this is that prior to this, there really wasn't a concept of, in this country, of freedom versus slavery, because everyone who was here was commissioned by the British government, right? So they were all under somebody's rule. The only people who were considered to be truly free were the planter elite or the extremely wealthy, the one, what we would call it, 1%. But now all of a sudden, anyone who is of European descent and has white skin has now been identified inherently as free. So what they've done is, in terms of white people, ontologically, physiologically, and even theologically, they've said that you are inherently free, right? And then they gave them guns, right? As a free person, you have a right to protect yourself. As a free person, you have a right to own land. As a free person, you have a right to do ... Then they turned over and they said, blackness. Blackness was defined literally, right? And this is in 1677 planter elite law. You see blackness defined as anyone of African descent with darker skin who is inherently, right? Inherently is a key word here, a slave. And so what they've done is they've taken Africans and then what they call like transmogrification, right? Like they've literally transformed them from Africans into slaves. So the term blackness and slaveness are the same thing. The term whiteness and freedom are the same thing. And this is why we tend to talk about race in terms of black and white, because those two terms, as it relates to this country, were created not only simultaneously, but antagonistic to one another. Because what you also saw was over time,
I see,
right? And so what also happened over time was they increasingly gave more rights and liberties to those who were white and discouraged them from interacting with people who were black. So those who had now been identified as white, they did a couple of things. One of the things that they did was they now, because they were free, they began to associate themselves with the wealthy elite. Because historically, those were the only free people, right? So now you have these poor, legitimately poor people who now are identifying themselves with the wealthy elite. And they're identifying themselves because they're all free and they're white. And all of a sudden now people are starting to refer to themselves as being white, because to be white is to be free. To be free is to be human, right? And now they're also disassociating themselves with black people, because to be black is to be slave. period. And so then you get an additional set of laws that says something. Basically what the laws got at was that, let's say a black person and a white person individually stole something. The white person would get 2 years added on. Let's say they would get 2 years in jail, right? Theoretically. The black person would get double the sentence. They would get 4 years in jail, right? And then they put in the law that if a white person conspired with a black person to commit a crime and they were caught, they would both be punished as if they were black. So now, if you're white, you definitely don't want to associate with the black person because your persecution is going to be greater.
Right.
Versus if you commit a crime on your own. Now, so this dichotomy is set up, right? This association with whiteness and freedom, blackness and slavery, this dichotomy, now they're opposed to one another. It's a setup, right? And what's crazy is if you think about the protests recently against the stay-at-home order, right? You see this play out in 2020, like this dynamic. You see it play out in 2020 when you look at the protest against the stay-at-home order, particularly when it started like in Minnesota and Wisconsin, when armed militia showed up to protest, right? They showed up with guns protesting. And if you look at the signs, and most of the signs that was there, it was about infringement upon liberties, right? Tyranny of government, right? And the one sign I read, it said, I would rather, it implied that this was a passive, or being told to stay at home was a passive form of slavery, right? And the reason why is because to be white is to be free. And to be free means you have the capacity and the ability to move in and out of any social space, any place you want, when you want. That is the definition of freedom. So for all of a sudden, someone to tell you that you can't go someplace is an infringement on your freedom, which is simultaneously an infringement on your whiteness, right? And then you go out to California, you have a social studies teacher, right? A certified social studies teacher in the state of California, and she's holding a sign, and the sign literally says, muzzles are for dogs and slaves. And then on the sign, there's a picture of a black woman with a slave muzzle on, right? Because
wow.
blackness and slaveness are the same thing, right? And you see signs, I'm not a slave, I'm white, right? Like these are some of the signs that were being held. And what's fascinating about this is that this speaks to these 1670s, these laws that were created literally 400 years ago that defined black and whiteness 400 years ago. And I'm pretty certain that most of these people have never read, 1600s planner elite laws. But the ideas that those laws created have been passed down for 400 years. They've been passed down through education. They've been passed down through our social systems. They've been passed down through whatever form of media that we had during the time, whether it's during plays, whether it's during radio or the invent of television and the internet. Like these the connection between whiteness and freedom, blackness and slaveness has been passed down.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's nothing but knowledge. I mean, I didn't know all of that in detail, and we're getting a lot of comments and questions, but I don't want to digress too far. I think that you really touched on a lot of the questions that were being asked. One question that was asked, though, was around, was that a countrywide definition or was it just the South? And it doesn't even really matter as it translates to today.
It was a definition. In 1677, there were really only people in Virginia. Like that's really where they were, right? This is where they were establishing the colonies. So this was pre-South and North, right? The idea of the South and the North did not exist yet at this time. These were the initial building of this nation is when these definitions were put into place.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that resonates with what you're saying about, blackness does not equal freedom for sure. It means sit down and be muzzled I was watching a video the other day, and something that resonated a little bit with me from that video is that since I was a kid, everything black is bad, so to speak. So there's blacklist, there's black balls, being blackballed. There's the black silhouette basically that people use to practice at the shooting range. There's blackmail, and even like in the old Western movies, if you look at some of those old ones, the bad guy, the bad cowboy, always wore black. And so it kind of like translates to me some of that, like, and I really want to understand too, in your opinion, why is it that, you know, black just it translates to bad in a lot of instances?
Well,
And does that have an impact on black people today and how maybe other affinities see black people?
well, I think that gets to the so Calvin Warren, he's a metaphysicist philosopher. He talks about blackness as delimitating the parameter or conditions that it cannot participate in. And what he's getting at, what he means by that is that even if you go back to the initial definitions of black and white, right? Whiteness as freedom, as it being inherently free, only has value, right? Its value assumes the potential of not being free, of being a slave, right? This is how we understand, this is how we conceptualize, right? If it's kind of idea like when your mom says like when you're a kid, you're special just like everyone else, right? If everybody is the popular person, then no one is the popular person, right? You know that you're part of the popular group because there is an unpopular group over there. So we understand ourselves in relation to other people. We understand that we're wealthy because there are people who are poor. We understand that we are poor because there are people who are wealthy, right? There's always this other in this comparison that takes place. The way that blackness and whiteness function within this country is that for whiteness to have its greatest value, which is freedom and humanity, the full breadth of humanity, right? And freedom, then in order for that to have its greatest value, there also has to be a sentient being that is non-human and does not have value, right? So there always has to be an antagonist. Every story has a protagonist and an antagonist, right? And the antagonist, part of their job is to make the protagonist more visible, to make them more seen, right? And so you get that with Black people in this country. We serve a unique function. Blackness, I should say, serves a unique function in that it defines the conditions, right, of what it means to be human, but yet it's not allowed to participate in being human. It defines the parameter, because once you become Black, you slave, right? Black and slaveness are the same thing, right? And so the moment you transgress into Blackness, what you've transgressed into is the bad, right? The further you get away from Blackness, the closer you are to the good, right? So like, what's interesting is if you think about our society, we talk about race in Black and white. Part of the reason why we do that is because statistics and stuff aside, just conceptually, what ends up happening is every other group comes to this country, and if whiteness is here and Blackness is here, every other group comes into this country and they figure out where they are on that spectrum, right? And the closer you are to whiteness, the more resources and advantages you have. The closer you are to the Blackness, right, the fewer that you have. And what's interesting is that when people come in, right, they won't necessarily stay in the same place. When you look at people from Asian descent, in World War II, they were closer to Black folk, right? We had Tokyo Jokyo, which was produced by Warner Brothers, which was literally a cartoon dehumanizing people who were Japanese during World War II. And it portrayed them as violent, hypersexual, stupid, and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And so within the American hierarchy, they were very close to Black people. By 1980, right, people of Japanese descent and people of Asian from the Asian province, broadly speaking, all of a sudden became model minorities. And to be a model minority is to be white-like. And they moved up the spectrum. But the only reason why the spectrum even exists is because you have to have two stable units. You have to have someone at the top and you have to have a bottom. So every other race knows its value in society, its position in society based on its distance from blackness and its proximity to whiteness, right? And the closer they are to whiteness, the more human they are, the more resources they have, right? And the closer they are to blackness, the less resources they have and the less human they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was reading, as I said earlier, doing some research and just trying to educate myself on the topic as it's been real to me, is that there was a 3/5 real to me. I'm serious. It's serious. I'm serious.
No,
I mean that.
No, it is. You're right. It is. It definitely is. Oh my God.
Literally.
No, it is real. It is definitely that.
It's real to me. And that's and the reason I said that is to say this is that there's the 3/5 clause. You know what I mean? So I want to understand where we've been. I want to understand more, which is why some of the reason we're having this conversation too, and to educate others where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going. And they're just laughing on the comments. Yeah, well,
They called me off guard. They called me off. She's like, this is real to me. I'm like, well, that's good. Like, it's
yeah, but I know we talk, and we know that to some people we talk, and to some people this is like almost, can be a hobby. Like, oh, I'm gonna, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hey, I read this book today. No, you don't get a gold star because you read a book and you know about the history. It's really just to better my understanding as I am, active in my community. They say history repeats itself. So I really want to understand the past so that I can understand our future and how we can impact our future. So, and I was looking at the 3/5 clause, and yes, it's recorded. I was looking at that 3/5 clause, and I think that that resonates completely. Seriously, that resonates completely to what you're saying, completely. And furthermore, when I think about that, holistically, everything that you just kind of talked about, it's almost a heavy topic. Like, how do you fix that when these tiers and this hierarchy is here? Because even though this is hundreds of years ago that all of this was established, if it's translating over to today, how do we further educate and besides conversations like that, and even fix a problem where there's a hierarchy like that? I think the first thing is to get people to realize it's a problem.
Well,
but
that's the first thing we have to do, right?
Right.
To realize that there is not even just racism in this country, right? But that there's white supremacy, racism, and anti-blackness, and these are three different components, right? And we have to be willing. We're starting to get to the point now where we're like, okay, we live in a racist society. There's racism that exists as well. At least some people are getting there, right? White supremacy has, honestly speaking, really just entered mainstream public discourse probably like within the last 4 years in any kind of meaningful way, right? Because we just talked about earlier, when Obama was in presidency, we were talking about a post-racial society, right? White supremacy has now started to find a space in mainstream public discourse, and in large part because with our current president, right, what we've had is this kind of uplift of white supremacist organizations who have now moved, quote unquote, into more public view. And so now we're using this language of white supremacy to point to them, but we've yet to understand really what white supremacy is and what it means to live in a white supremacist society, right? So we need to your question, one, we need to come to terms with the reality of white supremacy as a social and political reality, right? A social and political context in which we live. Right? We live in a white supremacist society. We also live in a society that is racist. And then we also live in a society that's anti-Black. So first we have to acknowledge those things. You about to ask me a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you think that using the terminology white supremacy is kind of a divisive term?
So, and I was telling you this before, like I'm always fascinated whenever I have conversations with people and the term white supremacy comes up and someone says to me, you know, that's divisive. I'm always kind of struck by the idea of white supremacy as a term being divisive. And I have a couple reactions to it, at least internally, right? And one of them is divisive for who, right? And usually what I find is that people are like, well, you know, it divides Black people and white people in this country, right? Divisive meaning causing a division, causing people to separate, right? And I'm like, well, so this is divisive for who? Like, who exactly is this causing to step away from the table, right? And the assumption is, and usually it's my white colleagues who express this sense of concern about the divisiveness of the term. But the assumption is that their non-white colleagues, right, have not always been saying this, right? And what I mean by that is that to say that white supremacy is divisive, the term is divisive, means that once it's introduced to a conversation, particularly between Black and whites, it introduces something to both of them that they may not have been aware of, that then causes them to step away from the table, right? But by and large, Black America has been talking about white supremacy forever, right? Black America is most overwhelmingly, Black America is very aware that we live in a white supremacist society. This is not new, right?
It doesn't take research.
Yeah, so you bringing that to the table as a term does not cause me to feel any differently than I did when I showed up, because I knew that when I came here, right? Now,
right.
Who it may be new to is the white person sitting at the table. And what may be happening is the fact that they are becoming aware that they are viewed by somebody differently than they view themselves, right? And that other person views society differently than they do.
So,
right?
Yeah. Do you think it's possible, Tom Galbo just asked the question, do you think there are as many Black supremacy groups? Is it possible to have Black supremacy first, is the first question I would have around that. Can there be Black supremacy?
Yeah, you could have any kind of supremacy group, really, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Because and this is the thing too, right? Whenever someone tells me that they have a problem with the term white supremacy, my knee-jerk reaction always is, well, what do you think it means, right?
Yeah.
And what I think is that most people say something to the effect of, it means that all white people are racist, right? Or that all white people, and I'm like, well, what do you mean by racist? Well, that we hate Black people, right? But that's not what white supremacy means.
Okay, what does it mean then?
White supremacy, by definition, simply white supremacy is a belief, an ideology, an idea that white people are superior to everyone else, right? That's it. Like that's the fundamental definition. The idea, it's an ideology that white people are superior to everyone else. And now what's fascinating is white people developed the term white supremacy, right? Like it was actually developed by academics right around 1865, academics who were trying to describe and justify why their society should cater to white people. And essentially what they were saying, pseudoscience was saying, was like, well, because white people are inherently superior. That's why, right? And so this goes back to your boy Johnson when he became president, when he says, America is a country for white people and it should be a government run by white people, right? This is what they're trying to understand and explain in 1865. They're like, and so white people actually coined the term it's an Americanism, right? They coined the term white supremacy to describe their beliefs about what it meant to be white. Now, what's ironic is that the definition of white supremacy does not require you to be white to believe in white supremacy, right? You can be any race and believe that white people are superior. And I would argue that if you were born and raised in this country, and to be honest with you, I think any country where that has been truly colonized by Europeans, right? You have been raised, let's talk about America, like specifically in this country. If you were raised here, then you were raised to be white supremacist. Doesn't matter what your race is. You were raised to believe that white people are superior. And you received
I see.
You've been told your whole life that white people, in various forms, in various articulations, that white people are superior through images, through television, through your education. The likelihood, right, statistically speaking, right, 70% of your teachers were white growing up, right? If you went to college, roughly 70, 80% of your professors were also white. 80 to 90% of the textbooks that you read while you were in college were written by people who were white, right? And so you spent your whole life being taught by white people about how they see the world, right? This is your entire formal education, right? If those of you who are listening right now, and I do this with my class all the time, take your phone out, take your cell phone out, right? And literally type in these words. Most attractive people in the world. Hit search, hit images. I can almost guarantee you the overwhelming majority of the people that you're now looking at are white, or they're white-like, right? They ascribe to some of the standards of whiteness of beauty, right? And what we have to keep in mind is that beauty and humanness are the same. They go hand in hand, right? And so we've been receiving these educations the entirety of our lives that white people are superior. And I don't care who you are, you've internalized this on some level, right? On some level. I can say that because I don't care who you are. If you live in an environment where the air is polluted, right? You can be by all medical standards the healthiest person in the world, but you still have toxins in your body. It's simply a byproduct.
Subliminal almost.
Well, it's the air that you breathe. It's everywhere that you go, right? It is the good guy wears white, the bad guy wears black, right? Like it's literally everywhere that you go, you're receiving and you're being reinforced in this particular format, right? And it's ingrained in our institutions, right? And so when you're talking about white supremacy, can you have black supremacy? Yes, you can have. I'm sure we have black supremacist groups. I'm guarantee it, right? I'm sure they're here in this country, right? But the distinction is that we live in a society that all of our social institutions are predicated on serving. They were designed to serve white people. Every social institution that we have. Because these institutions were built under the assumption that, because remember, this idea of white people being superior, the term white supremacy, as coined by white people, was in 1865, right? The belief was held long before then. We went back to the definitions, and we already know that when we define black and white, white meant free, black meant slave, which automatically creates a hierarchy, right? So this idea of people being superior, so every institution that we've built since 1677, right, has been based on the assumption that white people are superior. And so all of our social institutions are designed to serve white people, right, which is what makes them white supremacist institutions, right?
Okay.
And we know that they were designed to, because if you look at what they produce, every major social system in this country produces statistically better outcomes for whites. Whites are overwhelmingly represented at the top of the production for the best outcomes. Blacks are overly represented at the bottom for the worst outcomes. Does not matter what social institution you look at, right? And if you look at the primary pillars of any society, which is education, healthcare, criminal justice, and with education goes employment, right? We know that, let's look at something like employment. We know that a black male with a high school diploma and a white male with, matter of fact, you can take the exact same resume, and they've done this study. Princeton did this study, Cal Berkeley did this study. You take a resume and you put a person's name on it who is typically associated with being black. Take the same resume, put a person's name on it that's typically associated with being white, and you send them out. And what you will find is the person who has the white sounding name is 50 to 55% more likely to get a call back. Right?
Oh, wow. Wow.
Same resume, the exact same resume. We also know that if a black male and a white male interview for a job, the white male is 55% more likely to get the job. Now, if they both happen to get the job and they both have a high school diploma, same education, same work experience background, the black person will make roughly 40% less than the white person, right? They've also found you can give the white male a criminal record and a high school diploma, give a black male simply a high school diploma, and the white male will still be 40% more likely to get a job.
It's interesting.
So we see that, and we see it in education, where black students are in K through 12 are 5 to 7 times more likely to be diagnosed with attention problems, be diagnosed with behavioral problems, placed in special ed, less likely to graduate, more likely their behavior isn't the exact same, be punished for the exact same behavior that their peers not punished for if they're white. We know that in the criminal justice system, the exact same judge will give more harsher sentence to someone who is black than someone who's white for the exact same crime. We know that people who are black are 3 to 5 times more likely to be pulled over. We know that they're 7 to 9 times more likely to be overcharged. We know that black women who go into the healthcare system, despite their educational levels, despite their income levels, are 2 to 4 times more likely to either die or lose their children during the childbirthing process. My wife, who is an MD, who's married to a black man who has a PhD, my wife is 2 to 3 times more likely to die during her pregnancy, and so is our unborn child, than a white woman who has a GED and is poor, right? So you look at every major healthcare, education, and social system that we have, and what you see, you consistently produces better outcomes for people who are white and worse outcomes for people who are black. And the reason why is because those systems were initially designed to serve white people. They were not designed to serve people of color, right? And so as a result, right, when we enter into those systems aren't built for us. Right? That's what makes them a white supremacist system.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that's truly, you were just really giving a lot of facts and data right there. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were saying all of that is I've heard, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to get to the questions in a second, but it's really relevant. When you talk about the jobs, and let's go back to, you could have a black name on one resume and a white sounding name on the same exact resume. And it's more likely that that white person would get the job, the white sounding name would get that job. I've heard before affirmative action is reverse racism. And then I hear some of the stats and we're talking and unpacking about, societal supremacy. What do you think when you hear affirmative action is reverse racism then?
So racism is by definition the judgment of someone based on race. That's
okay.
Affirmative action attempts to correct a 400-year history of racism. Right? That's essentially what it's trying to do. Right? It's trying to offset 400 years of not only racism, but white supremacy and institutionalized supremacy. And so that's why affirmative action is in its place, right? Now, as far as the results of affirmative action, people have mixed feelings about it, whatever it may be. As far as it being reverse racism, I would strongly disagree, because what that implies is that it's saying that white people aren't good enough, right?
Yeah. And I just had a viewer comment that they were a victim of affirmative action. So I just put it up there. Yeah, Thomas Gobbo says he was a victim of affirmative action.
But what Thomas does not tell you, right, is that Thomas has always been, is throughout the course of his life as a white male. I just saw his photo. As a white male, he's also been the recipient of white supremacy and male patriarchy, right? And so him being a victim of affirmative action really is, if you have a business, white people make up 60% of the US population, roughly 60%. If you have a business and 90% of your work, of the people working in that business are white, what you have is an overrepresentation of white people. What affirmative action tries to do is make it more equitable, which means, you know what, if 60% of the people who are in this country are white, then 60% of people who are sitting in this office should be white, right? That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to correct the overrepresentation of white people in spaces, right? And the overrepresentation of white people exists within certain spaces because our social systems are designed to promote people who are white, right? And deter people who are not.
Okay. No, I completely get that. That's really good feedback. Dr. Byron, if you don't mind, I'd like to just pause before we go any deeper and answer some of those questions that are coming through in the comments. And Tom that is quoting, because I didn't leave it up there, he was on the Moments of Truth with us. So that's our Tom that is commenting. So one of the questions that Tom had that I did want to bring up is, he's asking, is he felt that racism still exists, but not white supremacy. And I want to make sure that.
So this is the thing. It's hard to argue that white supremacy doesn't exist in a coherent fashion. And I say that because white supremacy assumes, again, it is the belief that white people are superior. It does not mean that all white people are racist. It does not mean that all white people are bad. White supremacy says that white people are superior. All of our social institutions were built and designed for white people. Okay?
Yeah.
As such, right? If you look at, insofar as they were designed and built for white people, what you will consistently see is that white people have disproportionately better outcomes, period. And so you can tell me systems produce what they're designed to produce. If 60 to 80% of our prison actually 70 to 90, 60 to 85% of our prison population are Black people, right? And Black people only make up about 13% of the US population, then the system isn't broken. That's what it's designed to do. If 60% of our US population are white, but they only make up about 15 to 20% of our prison population, it's because that system was not designed to police white people's bodies, period. That is a white supremacist system. When I look at, I worked in criminal justice. When you look at the fact that between the ages of 18 to 25, white people are just as likely to not only use but sell drugs, right, as their Black counterparts. But they are 9 to 10 times less likely to even be pulled over, right? And 7 to 8 times less likely to even be charged if they are caught. What that tells me is that the system is designed to make sure that white kids aren't incarcerated. That's you know what I mean? So like, it's hard. I hear people say, "Oh, we don't live in a white supremacist society." It's like, if a system produces something, apple trees make apples. That's what they do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And we have another comment that kind of goes along that line. Frank Caputo basically is saying that it's rich people are superior or act superior versus white.
That is a Marxist kind of ideology, and I get that. But what I think with Frank, and for Frank, that may very well be the case, especially as a white man, because as a white man, but the thing is, there's hierarchies within whiteness, right? All white people aren't created equal. Like, they're not, right? Rich white people have much more value and access than poor white people. That is definitively true, right? But what you have is, you have white people here, and then you have your hierarchy of white people. Wealthy white people, heterosexual white, wealthy white people, wealthy white men, heterosexual, right? So forth and so on. And as you go further down this hierarchy of white folks, it gets worse and worse. But what you still have is you're white, and you're still above, even as a poor white person, right? You still have, one, you are affiliated with the dominant power, right? And so with that affiliation, whether you have access to all of it or not, the fact that you are affiliated, because let's be clear, race does not simply tell you what color my pigment is, right? Race tells you my relationship, my group's relationship to power, right? It's never just self-referential. So when I see a white person, I know, regardless of their economic status, they are affiliated with white America, whether they personally identify that way or not, which means they are affiliated with a certain level of power. If I see a police officer in a blue uniform, I know, regardless of who that police officer is, he is affiliated with a certain type of power by default, right? And so that affiliation, right, grants him access to things that he may not even be aware of, which may simply be the benefit of the doubt, right? Like, Frank can walk through my neighborhood, which is a highly affluent white neighborhood, and probably not have to worry about much of anything. Right? I am in my neighborhood because when someone sees me, they don't see my economic status. They don't. When I'm walking down the street, people don't see my economic status. They don't see my education. What they do see is my race. Right?
That before anything else, right?
Before anything else, they see my race and my gender. And they will treat me according. Matter of fact, my wife and I, when we first moved to Charlotte, we were apartment hunting. Mind you, my wife is an MD, right? I'm a PhD. We are okay financially, right? And we were looking for an apartment, and my wife looks like she's like 25 years old, right? Even though she's not. Me, I have tattoos everywhere, and we're walking around. And every apartment complex we went to in Uptown Charlotte, which is like, that's the place you want to be, right? And they're like, when the moment we get to the door, people are saying things like, well, are you sure you can afford it? Right?
Wow.
Right? Before they even show us an apartment, how much money do the two of you make together? Can you afford the down payment? This is how much the rent is. Like, nothing about the apartment, but everything about the financial component of it. Right? When we started looking for a house, the same thing. Matter of fact, we left a realtor because the realtor was concerned that we didn't have the economic wherewithal to buy in the areas we were looking to buy in, right? Because they didn't see my education, right? My wife and I, between the two of us, we have over 10 degrees between the two of us, right? They don't see that. They don't see our bank account. What they see is our race and our gender, right?
And just to understand that a little bit more, in your opinion, or in your expertise, this isn't necessarily the way that white people just view Black people, is it? Like, this is a challenge even for Black people of how we view our own, how we view Black people.
That is the default of being raised in a society that is predicated on, that is informed by white supremacy,
right?
And anti-Blackness, right? Because it's important to name both of those, and because we all receive the same education. Like, like, Black people are taught the same things about Black people via the news, via television, via school that white people are taught. Now, one of the differences is, right, is that we are Black, right? So we so we receive an everyday counter education, but that doesn't mean we don't internalize those things, right? I mean, Black people suffer, even in academic spaces, Black people who are highly successful, what they call like imposter syndrome, right? Where they feel like they're questioning whether or not, even though they've gone to school for 15 to 20 years, done the work, went to Princeton, went to Vanderbilt, went to Yale, went to wherever, right? And they've earned the right to be in a space, they're now questioning whether or not they're really legitimate or not, right? And this is part of growing up as a Black person in a society that constantly tells you that Black people are inferior, right? Part of the reason why, I mean, historically, you look at like Black women trying to straighten their hair, right? We've had people who've gotten rich off of skin lightening creams for Black people, right? All trying to approximate white America, right?
Right.
Because if we can look like them, right? This is part of the what do they call it? The respectability politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
To show white people that I'm good enough, they'll accept me, right? They'll be nicer towards me, right? This is all a product of being told that you as a Black person are not enough, that you are insufficient, that you are inferior, right? And so, yes, like Black people receive the same education that white people receive, which is the same education that anyone, I don't care what your race is, if you grew up in this country, you receive the same primary education. White people are superior because white is freedom and humanness. Black people are inferior because Blackness is slaveness, period. Mm-hmm. Everybody else falls somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Right? And just to take this comment, Tom's asking, who told us that Blacks were, or told you that Blacks were inferior? I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you were going back to kind of like that societal challenge we've had from whites are here, Blacks are here, and even people that come from other countries, but this is the bottom. We don't want to be that.
I had a friend of mine who, when I was in school, he was from Africa. He was Nigerian, great guy. And he told me, he said when he first got here, he did not want to associate with African Americans. He was like,
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, he was like, I ain't doing it. And he was telling me, and I was like, why? He was like, because I knew before I came here that basically you all are at the bottom of the totem pole, right? And he said what he realized very quickly, because he was Nigerian, but he grew up in Britain. So he had this British accent, right? You know what I'm saying? And he said he noticed that when people first saw him, they would react one way, but the moment he began to speak and they realized that he wasn't quote unquote African and he was a different type of Black, right? All of a sudden they treated him differently. And he was like, I didn't want to be associated with y'all. He's like, because y'all get the bad end of the stick. He's like, so every time I went somewhere, I tried to talk as much as possible so people knew that I was Black, but I wasn't American Black, right? Like, and
I'm not one of them.
Yeah, and so we have these things that take place. And we have, again, but we have colorism in the Black community, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, colorism is a real thing. I remember I was dating this young woman in Louisiana, and her mother introduced me as he's nice looking for a dark skinned guy. Like that's how I was introduced. Like that's how, and I was like, did that just happen? Like that's how I was introduced, right? And,
oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, but colorism is a real thing in the Black community, and I think Black women feel it probably even more so than Black men.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely.
Like like your life is, not that it's great, but it's a lot better than a dark-skinned Black woman, because again, it's about this approximation to whiteness. If you are light-skinned with straight hair, you are considered more attractive, not just to mainstream America, but even within your own Black community.
Absolutely, the brown paper bag rule.
Exactly. We literally had collegiate institutions where you had to send in a photo of yourself next to a brown paper bag, and these are historically Black colleges, and if you were darker than the bag, they would deny you entrance. And the reason was, and this is what we don't talk about, right? Mm-hmm. Schools were typically schools where you would go someplace to study anything other than a trade. right? So if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a school teacher, those are typically the schools that had the brown paper bag rule. And the reason why they had it is because they knew that the lighter you were, the more likely you were going to be able to actually do those things in the real world. Because like the lighter you are, the more likely white America will allow you to be a doctor. The more likely white America will allow you to be a school teacher. Because what we do know is there's no point in wasting all this time, energy, and resources on this dark-skinned Black person to make them a medical doctor. When they get out in the real world, white America is not going to allow them to practice, right? And so this reinforces this colorism within the own Black community. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think it translates. It's a real topic, colorism. So the Black people see us in the same light as whites, and so it's a problem internally for the affinity of Black people as well as for those that are non-Black. And Tom, I know that there's a question. Name one school that did that. I'm gonna tell you, it was real. We're not just
Spelman, Hampton, Fisk. Like,
I'll tell you to do it. There were a lot of schools, but the thing is, though, down south that did it.
But the thing is, they did those things. The logic behind it was sound. Like that was sound logic, right? Because if you were my complexion, it didn't matter how much you knew, right? No one's going to let you perform surgery. No white community is going to allow you to perform surgery or to go to their medical school or to practice medicine in their space. They're not going to do it. But what they would, like my mom's side of family, we have family members who could pass, right? Like on my mom's side, I literally have folk who have blonde hair and blue eyes, but they are Black. Like their mom is Black, their dad is Black. But when they're walking around in America, people assume that they're white, right? That Black person, right, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that Black person is more likely to gain access because they are perceived as white. So if we're going to invest our resources as a community in somebody, we're going to try to invest it in someone who is most likely to gain access, right? So the logic behind it is sound, right? Now the psychological and social implications of it are treacherous. But the reasoning makes sense. So it's like, you dark-skinned Black person, you can go down to Tuskegee, right? Or FAMU, and you can learn to be a farmer, a tractor driver, because those kind of jobs, white people will employ you and they don't care how dark you are, because that's where they feel like you belong anyway, doing trade work, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I know we're at an hour, but I have a couple. If you have a little bit more time, I do have some stuff I really have on my mind. So, in my circle, I've seen as of late a lot of tension around how Black people address white people. So what I mean is, a Black person can say something like, "White people need to understand," and etc. But then if a white person were to say, Black people need to understand, it's seen as racist. White people can't even say "you people" without being put in the corner for timeout. So what I've been seeing a lot of, and what's swirling is, hey, not only is that divisive, but it's a double standard. And how do we work through that? Why is that allowed? So what do you think about that?
One, I don't know that it's a double standard. And the reason why I say that is that when we were talking about earlier about the idea of being white equal to freedom, right? Historically, white Americans have been able to say and do pretty much whatever they want, right? With limited repercussions, right? Particularly from, they could say what they, Nixon was literally, Nixon, this is Richard Nixon, this is the president right before Ronald Reagan, right? Nixon was the first president, right, in the history of this country who said, you know what, probably shouldn't say the N-word anymore, right? his campaign manager said to him, you know what, you can't say the N-word anymore because it's, people get a little sensitive about it, but you can use these other political terms to talk about Black people without talking about Black people, right? And so for the first time, you start to see the language and behaviors of white Americans being policed, right? Now, when you look at other marginalized groups, particularly Black folk, our language and our behavior is always policed. Always. The moment I step out of my house, I do not communicate with anyone outside of in a public space the same way I communicate in my home. I do not. I never could. Right.
Right.
The reality is the world that I live in, right? And this is what they call about the double consciousness, right? Living in two different realities. Because the world that I live in is governed by white, Eurocentric norms and standards. Even the way that I am dressed now, right? In the way that you are dressed, what is considered professional attire. There's a reason why professional attire in the United States looks the way it does. It is a Eurocentric view of aesthetics or beauty. It's what it is, right? In any place that's been colonized or it has been impacted by colonization has the same aesthetics, right? Now, if you go someplace that has not been colonized, their culture is whatever the norm is, right? So there is this policing, I think, that's now starting to take place particularly of white America, that has not happened before. And so now it feels like a double standard. It feels like I can't say anything anymore. And it's like, well, that's not true, right? Not that you can't say anything, but you have to be more cognizant of what you say, right? Because now what you say has consequences for you. And that has not historically been the case, right? Whereas the person who's talking, the Black person across from you, right? What they say has always had consequences for them. So it's not really a double standard. It's actually more, it's starting to level the playing field, right? Now, is it uncomfortable? Yes, no doubt, right? Is it a challenge to be more cognizant about your language when it's not something you've ever had to really do before? Yes, right? Is it a double standard that you're being asked to do it? I would disagree with that, right? I think now what is happening is, I mean, it's the same thing. You look at like, anytime you have a marginalized population, right? And we talk about the LGBTQ plus communities, right? There are certain things you can't say now as it relates to those communities that you could say 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 15 years ago.
This is true.
Right? But the language about them has had to change because they have started to garner more power. When you have ultimate power, you don't have to worry about repercussions. You say and do what you want to do. But when other groups start to acquire power, now all of a sudden, just like their behavior was always policed, now some of your behavior is starting to be policed. We see the same thing with the women's lib movement, right? Women historically have had no power, so men could treat them any kind of way they wanted to in workspaces, so forth and so on, right? And then you have the women's lib movement and you have the Me Too movement, and now women start trying to acquire more social power. And so now it's like, listen, when you come at me in the workspace, when you say X, Y, and Z, that's problematic. And part of the reason why that Black person or that woman can say something sexual to you as a man, but you can't say it back to her, is because there's a power differential, right? There's a significant power difference between the two of you.
Yeah.
I can say something, so for instance, like I could say that the white person next to me, I could be like, for an example, I might say, you know what? You're an idiot, right? As a white person, you're just not very bright. You're not good at your job, right? But if I don't have any power, right, my opinion of him does not matter. It's just an opinion. But if he says, Dante, you're Black and you're an idiot, right? His opinion of me, if he has power, can now affect my future. It can affect the likelihood of me getting a job. It can affect the fact that I might get a promotion.
I see what you're saying.
So when you have these distinctions in power, right, what people say matters significantly, right? I had a colleague who I used to work with. She's a white female, and she's good people, and she would lay into white men, just lay into them, right? And the white men would largely just kind of sit back and be like, whatever, because at the end of the day, like, we run this company, so it doesn't matter, right? And she did the same thing to one of her peers who was a black woman, right? She laid into her in a public space and basically not demoralized her, but definitely called her out in some ways that were problematic. And then when she and I were talking, right, I was like, you do realize those white men, you didn't do any damage to them, right? But you might have just cost that black woman her career because your word about her carries more weight than her performance does. Your word about those white men means nothing. You see what I'm saying? So the power distinction is the other component too.
Right. I got you.
Helps at all, right?
No, that totally explains it. And as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking of the other terminology you hear sometimes in a professional environment. As a Black person, it kind of makes you cringe, or it's like, really, what do you mean? Is, oh wow, you speak so well, those types of things. So just having to be cognizant about those and what those imply. Like, oh, you didn't expect me to be able to speak effectively, I guess. So yeah, absolutely. There was a question in the comments, and it was around the N word. I have my own opinion. I'll share it with you. But what are your thoughts around the usage of the N word? The specific question is, do you feel the use of the N word perpetuates racism? And
no.
Okay, let's take it.
My knee-jerk reaction is no. What do you mean by
white person says it? Is it okay? Does it perpetuate racism?
I don't think that. I don't know why a white person would want to say it.
Okay.
Right. And what I mean by that is that every population, every community has language that is exclusive to that community. Right. That in most of it is language. It's usually some kind of sub-community, and within that sub-community, they have language, right, that is exclusive to that community. More often than not, that language was used initially to oppress them or to marginalize them by a more powerful group, right? And what that sub-community has done is they've taken that language and they've kind of transformed it into something else within that community, right? Okay. And so like, so there are terms. One of my good friends, he passed recently. He was bisexual, and I would listen to him talk to his significant other, right? And some of his friends who also either bisexual or gay, and the things that they would call each other, right? The terms that they would use were all terms that in my mind were considered derogatory when they were said about that community, right?
Really?
And they are when they're said by someone who's not part of that community. Here's a better example that you'll probably be able to relate to, right? If you're on the phone with your girlfriend and y'all are going back and forth,
I know what you're going to say.
You'd be like, let me tell you about this B. He done lost his mind, yada, yada, yada. And you can call her all kinds of B's that you want to, right? Yeah. It's understood within that community as an act of endearment, right? An act of solidarity. Now, let some dude walk in the room and say the same thing to you. He's not part of this community, right?
What did you say?
Hold on. What you just said to me, you've overstepped your role, right? And so just like I have no desire to, my friend, I have no desire to refer to him using these historically derogatory terms that they've transformed within their community. I have no desire to use them when I'm talking to him, right? Like none. Like that's, yeah. And so I'm always baffled that white people, or well, not white people, but some white people are like, well, how come I can't say the N word? And my question to them is, why do you want to? Like, why is it? Do you want to? I mean, because every sub community does this. It's not unique to the Black community, right? The gay community, they have a set of language and terms that were used to oppress and that they've transformed into affirmations about themselves. The lesbian community has done this. The Mexican American community has done this. The Jewish community has done this, right? The German community is. Every community has done this, but yet, you know what I mean? And if you're not part of those communities, you are not allowed to say those things without some type of repercussions. So what is it about the N word that you feel like you need to be able to say it?
Yeah.
I'm always
is there like intent and does intent or context even matter to add on as a question?
I don't know intent, right? I don't.
Okay, that's true. That's
what
true.
I do know is you're not part of my community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, you know, and because you're not part of this community, right? This is off limits to you, right? Mm-hmm. That's a difficult thing sometimes for a lot of white people to understand because they're not, again, historically, whiteness means freedom. Freedom means you move about however you see fit. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden you're telling me there's someplace I can't go? That's problematic, right?
Right.
I'm told all the time places I can't go or places I need to be really careful when I go. Right? Sundown towns, right? In my own neighborhood, right? Like I said, we have about 385 homes in our neighborhood. About 385. Probably about 15 of them are Black families. 3 of us live next door to each other, right? One of the things I like to do late at night is pace and walk up and down the street. And I'm a late night person. So it might be 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. I'll be walking up and down, but I'll take my dog, right? Now I see other white people doing this all the time, kind of randomly walking around, right? Every time I do it, somebody stops me. Or out of nowhere, a police officer comes driving through our neighborhood, which you never see, right? They'll come driving through the neighborhood and they'll pull up next to me and ask me, am I okay? And it's me and I have a schnauzer mixed with something else. He's like 9 pounds, right? Same thing if I'm sitting in my car in a parking lot, right? I've sat in my car in a parking lot there's a gas station next to my house I go to all the time. I know everybody on every shift. They know me by first name, right? And they've told me, and I'll go there sometimes, get a cup of coffee and just kind of sit in the parking lot and drink my coffee, right? And they've told me on several occasions that they've gotten phone calls from the police department asking, is there someone in your parking lot who shouldn't be there? And they'll give a description of my car. And they were like, that's just Dante, right?
Wow.
Because I know that there's certain places I should go and cannot go, and the things I need to be very cognizant of, so forth. But I'm used to being policed in that way. But if your identity is associated with freedom, for someone to tell you that you can't say certain things or that you can't go certain places, all of a sudden feels like not just an infringement on your rights, but an infringement on actually who you are, your fundamental identity. Hence, the young woman's sign in California, right? Muzzles are for slave restriction. You might as well say restrictions, rules, regulations, limitations are for slaves and dogs. I'm a white person. This should not be applying to me, right? Now, do all white people feel this way? No, but there is a significant portion that do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Dr. Bryant, this has been an amazing conversation. I've learned a ton of information. I know that folks watching now and watching in the future will learn. I wanted to give you an opportunity, if you had any closing thoughts or comments that you want to share with everyone, to please do so. And before I do that, I want to say that I have a better understanding of why racism is thought of in the terms Black and white. And that's because it's majorly Black and white, literally. And now when I think about it, I'm going to remember those different, hand gestures and then where we fit in. Yeah. And I think that's even where the media picks up on it in everything because of history. So
Yeah.
I want to give you an opportunity to say any closing statements, and I really appreciate you as usual. You're
No,
welcome.
no, I appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's important to remember that racism exists. Yes, right. White supremacy is a certain type of racism. It's a type of racism that assumes that white people are superior, right?
Mhm.
Um, Me personally, and people ask me this all the time, do you feel like all white people are racist? To be honest with you, it doesn't really matter to me. I don't know what any of all of any people are. I don't know, right? Um, and I've never been one to call someone racist, to call someone white supremacist, unless that's how they self-identify, right? And I have met people who self-identify that way, right? But what I would say is that, I think it was Emerson who says, um, "What you're doing speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying." Right? I don't know what people believe, but I know what people do. I can see what people do and what they don't do. Right? Um, if you are somebody who is adamant about not just ending racism, but white supremacy and anti-blackness, right? Then you need to do things, right? To sit back passively and simply allow those systems to be is the support of those systems, right?
Right.
If you believe that society should be better, then do something. If you don't know what to do, ask the people who are most negatively impacted by those systems, and instead of arguing with them, simply believe them, right?
Yeah.
Believe that what they're telling you is the truth, and then act accordingly, right? So
Absolutely. We appreciate you. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Speak to you soon.
you take care.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care. Bye.